I thought that I would start sort of at the beginning with the family members who moved here from various parts in the world. So perhaps I could first talk about my great-grandfather. That would be my mother's father's father, whose name was E.C. Johnson. And he first came up here into what's now Alberta, it was then Northwest Territories, from Wyoming in the employ of the 76 Ranch in 1888, looking for grass. The ranch wanted to expand and the homesteading was taking over and forcing out the big open range ranches. They sent him up here looking for grass, and he picked an excellent piece of ground for the 76, 5,000 acres of land at Mosquito Creek near Nanton, what's now Nanton, Alberta. And he liked what he saw. He rode back to Wyoming and spent another year or two. It was 88 or 89 or 90 that he came up to stay. He had been born in Virginia in 1860. He ran away from home when he was 13, sort of worked his way west across the U.S., got tangled up with a bunch of Texas cowboys returning from a cattle drive, and spent some time down there with them, wound up in Deadwood, South Dakota at one time. And by this time he was late teens. And he wound up driving a stagecoach in and out of Deadwood for a while, riding shotgun on a stagecoach, and met a number of the characters of the day, including Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody and some of these folks. He rode on a scouting mission with Buffalo Bill Cody in the employ of the U.S. Army. He moved west from there and turned up in Wyoming in the employ of the 76 Ranch. I said, came north looking for cattle, for grass, but he met a number of people, of course, along his way. And two of the other cowboys on the 76 Ranch in Wyoming in the late 1880s were a couple of guys called Harry Longbaugh and Leroy Parker. When Dad Johnson, as he became known to the family, Eb Johnson, came to what's now Alberta, he wound up in the employ of the Bayou Ranch south of Longview. And I believe there was a fellow there by the name of Fred Stimpson was the manager. And he hired Dad Johnson on as the foreman. And Dad Johnson sent for his buddy Harry Longbaugh to come up from Wyoming and break horses for him at the ranch. At the time, Fred Stimpson's wife was sort of chronically ill, and he hired a trained nurse from England called Mary Bigland. And she turned up in the employ of Fred looking after his wife. And they met and wound up getting married. And in 1891, they were married in Knox, at the time, Knox Presbyterian Church in downtown Calgary. It's still there. It's called Knox United Church now. And Longbaugh was the best man, and we have the documents that show that. And of course, Longbaugh later became known as the Sundance Kid, and Leroy Parker became known as Butch Cassidy. There's no record of Butch Cassidy ever having been up here. Longbaugh was only here for a year or so, and he went back to Wyoming and got together with Leroy, and they started robbing trains. But now, Dad Johnson came here in 1889. A book of his life written by a retired history professor called John Jennings it suggests that he wanted out of the American West because of the lawlessness of it. There was hundreds of lynchings. There was all kinds of stuff going on that just didn't sit with him. And so he came up here. I believe the Johnson County War was in 1892. And he would have been in the middle of that had he stayed, because he was a foreman to one of the big ranches that was right in the ground zero of the Johnson County War. And then Johnson County there's no relation to Dad Johnson. I don't know what Johnson that was named after. But anyway, so up he came. He worked at the Bayou for a few years. They had 4 kids, included Jesse, I think was the oldest, Bert, my grandfather, Laurie, and another girl, Dot, they called her. He was in the employ of, after he left the Bayou, he moved to Calgary in order that the kids could get a bit of education. and he was in the employ of a cattle buying firm, a livestock brokerage. And he rode and drove around southern Alberta buying cows and cattle for this brokerage. In 1910, the family moved to Cochrane, and they started a butcher shop. His wife, Mary, was a trained nurse, and she worked for a while in what they called the Cochrane Hospital, which is a brick building that's been recently refurbished and moved to the Cochrane Ranch. I don't have a lot of information about where Mary went later, but more about Dad Johnson, and that's largely because he lived a lot of the time in the last years of his life with my grandparents, and would confide and tell stories about his previous life to my grandmother, who of course loved that sort of thing and wrote memoirs about it. And he sort of, after they sold the butcher shop, he was sort of retirement age, and he died in 1946, and he's buried in the cemetery in Calgary. My father's grandfather, Harry Butters, moved from Woodstock, Ontario, also in about 1890, 89, 90, 91, in that range somewhere, and farmed at Balzac, which is almost in Calgary now, but it was a long ways from Calgary in those days. So I don't know a lot about his family, but I know that that's where they lived. And his son, Gordon Butters, married a Swedish immigrant, and they farmed in the Swedish enclave of Conridge, what is now Conridge. So that's what I sort of know about the great-grandparents.